It was the most lopsided fight imaginable. One submarine versus the vast Japanese Armada. Yet, against insurmountable odds, the crew of the USS Gudgeon turned the ocean depths into their battlefield. What unfolded beneath the waves would become a tale of unrelenting courage, bold tactics, and triumph in the face of certain defeat. This is the story of the lone submarine that refused to surrender. Before we continue, friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It takes just a second for you, but it gives me incredible motivation to keep creating these videos. I'd also greatly appreciate your comments. Thank you for your support. And now, let's dive back into the story. The Pacific in 1942 was a theater of domination for the Japanese Imperial Navy. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan rapidly expanded its reach, asserting control over vast swathes of the Pacific. Their armada, the largest and most powerful in the region, sailed confidently through these waters, securing supply lines and isolating Allied forces. The seas seemed invincible under their grasp, creating a stranglehold that threatened to choke off all Allied resistance in the region. It was a time of fear, desperation, and audacious plans. Amidst this chaos, one lone submarine, USS Gudgeon, became a symbol of defiance. Its mission was clear: to infiltrate enemy waters, disrupt Japanese supply lines, and, if possible, strike at the very heart of their naval might. The vessel, a fleet submarine of the Gado class, was state-of-the-art for its time, but still faced limitations compared to its targets. Outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in a theater dominated by their enemy, the men of the Gudgeon understood the risks. Yet, it was their daring spirit and the unshakable resolve of their commander, Lieutenant Commander Elton Grenfell, that set them apart. Grenfell was a leader forged in adversity. Known for his calm demeanor and sharp tactical instincts, he inspired both confidence and loyalty in his crew. His style of command blended meticulous planning with a readiness to adapt to the chaos of war. The crew of the Gudgeon shared their captain's determination. Many were young, some just out of training, but all were united by a common purpose: to stand as a silent vanguard in the Pacific, where failure meant both death and strategic collapse for the Allied war effort. The strategic importance of their mission could not be overstated. With Japan tightening its grip on vital shipping routes, the submarine fleet of the U.S. Navy represented the only immediate threat capable of penetrating their dominance. Allied forces on the ground and at sea were stretched thin. Each lost convoy, each supply ship sunk, brought the enemy closer to total supremacy. The Gudgeon was tasked with patrolling perilous waters near the Japanese mainland, where the enemy was strongest and Allied forces weakest. Success could disrupt Japanese operations. Failure was unthinkable. The looming question haunted every member of the crew as they prepared for their mission. How could one submarine challenge an armada? The odds were impossibly steep. Japanese ships bristled with sonar, depth charges, and seasoned crews honed by months of uninterrupted victory. And yet, the Gudgeon's crew pressed forward, motivated not by the odds, but by the conviction that their fight mattered. As the vessel slipped silently beneath the waves, its crew knew they were embarking on a journey that could define the war's future and etch their names into history. Their story, one of ingenuity, resilience, and raw courage, would come to embody the very spirit of resistance in the Pacific. Little did they know, their mission would make them a legend and a testament to the power of determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The first real test of the USS Gudgeon's resolve came just 3 days into its mission. While patrolling near the Luzon Strait, a mechanical whine pierced the otherwise steady hum of the submarine's propulsion system. Chief Engineer Marcus Mac McAllister, a no-nonsense veteran of over a decade in the Navy, recognized the problem immediately: a coolant leak in the starboard engine. The issue threatened to reduce the submarine's speed and compromise its ability to evade enemy ships. McAllister barked orders to his team, working tirelessly in the cramped, stifling engine room to patch the problem. Sweat dripped down his face as he muttered under his breath, "She's a stubborn beast, but she'll hold." The patchwork fix held for now. Not long after, the Gudgeon encountered another complication. The onboard sonar system, critical for detecting enemy ships, began to misread signals, throwing false echoes across the operator's screen. Sonar technician Robert Bobby Langley, a 19-year-old fresh out of training, nervously adjusted the dials, hoping to recalibrate the equipment. Grenfell loomed behind him, his calm but stern presence keeping Langley's nerves in check. "Take a breath, Langley," the captain said softly. "This isn't training, but you're ready." After an agonizing half-hour of tinkering, Langley managed to isolate the problem. A loose connection in the transducer relay. The system sputtered back to life, just in time to detect the faint sound of propellers approaching from the north. The propellers belonged to a Japanese destroyer, and its presence signaled the start of a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Grenfell ordered the Gudgeon to descend and hold position near the thermocline, a natural layer of water that distorted sonar signals. The destroyer passed, its engines rumbling ominously overhead. In the oppressive silence of the submarine, every creak of the hull sounded like a death knell. Radio man Jimmy O'Hara, a father of 3 from Iowa, clutched a small picture of his family. He had hidden it in his uniform pocket against regulations and whispered a quick prayer. For minutes that felt like hours, the crew waited, their breaths held until the sound of the destroyer faded into the distance. Relief was short-lived. A coded message intercepted by Allied intelligence in Hawaii revealed that a large Japanese convoy, heavily guarded and laden with supplies, was on course through the East China Sea. Grenfell gathered his senior officers in the cramped wardroom to discuss the new intelligence. The intercepted signal had been transmitted via the Allies' groundbreaking work on decrypting Japanese naval codes, a feat that had turned the tide of several recent operations. The message detailed the convoy's approximate size and route, but left gaps in its timing. Grenfell and his officers pored over maps and charts, calculating the most likely course for interception. "If we can hit this convoy," Grenfell said, his voice low but resolute, "we can make a real dent in their operations. But we'll be on our own out there." For the young crew, the decision to pursue the convoy meant plunging into the heart of enemy-controlled waters. Among them was torpedo man Hank Vargas, a street-smart kid from Brooklyn who had joined the Navy to escape a life of poverty. Vargas spent the hours leading up to the planned interception inspecting the submarine's Mark 14 torpedoes, well aware of their notorious reliability issues. The torpedoes had a reputation for running too deep or failing to detonate on impact, a flaw that had cost lives in earlier missions. Vargas double-checked every warhead, muttering, "You're going to work for me today, or we're all done for." As the Gudgeon neared the convoy's projected path, the tension aboard the submarine reached a fever pitch. In the dim red glow of the control room, the crew whispered in hushed tones, their voices tinged with both fear and determination. The sonar operator's headset crackled with the rhythmic pulse of distant propellers. Grenfell stood at the periscope, scanning the horizon for any sign of the convoy. His voice cut through the silence. "Contact. Multiple ships. Looks like we've found them." The convoy appeared as shadows against the faint moonlight, a cluster of transport ships flanked by destroyers. The Gudgeon was outnumbered and outgunned, but it had one crucial advantage: stealth. Grenfell ordered the submarine to submerge deeper, plotting a careful course to intercept the convoy from its flank. Every man aboard knew the risks. There would be no room for error. The Japanese escort ships were equipped with advanced sonar and depth charges capable of turning the submarine into a steel coffin. As the Gudgeon crept closer to the convoy, the tension became almost unbearable. Quartermaster Tom Red Foster, a grizzled sailor with a quick wit and a penchant for storytelling, sat quietly at his station. The usually talkative Foster was uncharacteristically silent, his hands steady as he monitored the submarine's depth and course. When one of the younger sailors asked him if he was scared, Foster replied with a wry grin, "Kid, we're all scared. But scared's what keeps you sharp." Grenfell gave the final orders to prepare for an attack. The crew moved with practiced precision, each man at his station. The torpedo room buzzed with activity as Vargas and his team loaded the first salvo into the tubes. The faint sound of the convoy's propellers grew louder, a steady drumbeat that mirrored the pounding of the crew's hearts. Grenfell raised the periscope again, watching as the convoy drifted into range. "Stand by!" he ordered. The crew held their breaths, their eyes fixed on their instruments. The moment of truth had arrived. The USS Gudgeon crept toward the convoy, its engines humming softly beneath the waves. Inside the control room, the air was thick with anticipation. Lieutenant Commander Grenfell stood by the periscope, his brow furrowed in concentration as he watched the dark outlines of the Japanese ships approach. The convoy was larger than anticipated, with at least 4 transports flanked by 3 destroyers. Grenfell's sharp eyes caught the faint glint of moonlight off a destroyer's bow, its angular silhouette a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. In the torpedo room, Hank Vargas and his team moved with precision, preparing the tubes for their first strike. Every clink of metal against metal seemed amplified in the confined space, each sound a potential giveaway to their prey above. Vargas leaned in close to inspect the torpedoes one final time, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the depth settings. "This one's got to run straight," he muttered under his breath. Beside him, a younger seaman named Charlie Brent nervously asked, "What if it doesn't?" Vargas shot him a look, half reassurance, half warning. "It will. And if it doesn't, we won't live long enough to care." Grenfell's voice crackled over the intercom. "Torpedo room, stand by. All stations, prepare for action." The submarine glided into position, its movements deliberate and calculated. Grenfell had chosen a narrow undersea channel bordered by rocky outcrops, using the natural terrain to mask the Gudgeon's presence. Quartermaster Tom Foster guided the submarine with steady hands, his eyes flicking between the depth gauge and navigation charts. Each adjustment to the course had to be perfect. Even the slightest miscalculation could send them scraping against the jagged seafloor or exposing their position to the enemy above. In the radio room, Jimmy O'Hara adjusted his headset, listening intently for any sign of Japanese transmissions. The faint crackle of static filled his ears, interrupted only by the occasional burst of hurried Japanese commands. "They're coordinating their escorts," O'Hara reported to the bridge. "Destroyers are on high alert." Grenfell acknowledged the report with a curt nod, his mind already calculating the convoy's defensive patterns. "They're looking for trouble," he said. "Let's make sure they find it where they least expect." The plan was to strike the convoy's center, targeting a transport carrying what appeared to be military vehicles. Grenfell's reasoning was clear. Disrupt the convoy's cargo, and the escorts would be forced to protect their charges instead of pursuing the Gudgeon. The attack had to be precise and fast. Any delay would invite retaliation from the destroyers, whose depth charges could reduce the submarine to twisted wreckage in minutes. As Grenfell watched through the periscope, he issued the command, "Flood tubes 1 and 2. Stand by to fire." Vargas felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the familiar hiss of water flooding the tubes echoed through the compartment. He glanced at Charlie, who was gripping the edge of a console so tightly his knuckles were white. "Breathe, kid," Vargas said. "You're no good to anyone if you pass out." Grenfell's voice broke the silence. "Fire 1. Vargas pressed a button, and the torpedo shot forward with a muffled whoosh. The second followed moments later. In the control room, everyone held their breath as the seconds ticked by. O'Hara whispered a silent prayer, his fingers clutching the edges of his console. Foster, his jaw clenched, muttered under his breath, "Come on, baby. Hit it." The first torpedo struck its target dead center. The explosion lit up the night, a fiery blossom of water, metal, and smoke erupting from the transport's hull. The ship began to list heavily to one side, its deck engulfed in flames. Cheers erupted from the torpedo room, but the celebration was cut short by the sound of the destroyer's engines roaring into action. Grenfell's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent. "All hands, battle stations. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." The Japanese destroyers wasted no time. their searchlights piercing the darkness as they closed in on the Gudgeon's position. The first depth charges detonated with bone-rattling force, sending shockwaves reverberating through the submarine. In the torpedo room, Vargas was thrown against a bulkhead, the impact knocking the wind out of him. "Stay on your feet," he shouted, helping Charlie secure loose equipment. Grenfell's quick thinking was the Gudgeon's saving grace. He ordered the submarine to dive sharply, steering it toward a nearby thermal layer that could disrupt the destroyer's sonar. Foster executed the maneuver with precision, guiding the submarine deeper as more depth charges exploded above them. The noise was deafening, each blast a reminder of how close death was. In the control room, Grenfell barked orders with the confidence of a seasoned leader. "Level out at 300 feet. Rig for silent running. Hold position." The crew complied, their movements swift and silent. O'Hara's hands trembled as he monitored the faint sonar pings of the destroyers circling above. "They're sweeping for us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. For what felt like an eternity, the Gudgeon lay motionless, its crew straining to hear every sound. The destroyers dropped another round of depth charges, but this time the explosions were farther away. Grenfell seized the opportunity. "Bring us around, heading 280. Let's put some distance between us and those bastards." As the submarine crept away, the tension aboard slowly eased. In the mess, O'Hara slumped into a corner, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Foster joined him, offering a rare moment of levity. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jimmy." O'Hara managed a weak smile. "More like I heard one, and it was carrying depth charges." Meanwhile, in the torpedo room, Vargas leaned against the bulkhead, exhaustion etched into his face. Charlie handed him a canteen, his hands still shaking. "Do you think we'll make it out of this?" he asked. Vargas took a long drink before replying. "We don't have a choice, kid. We're here to fight, and fight we will." Grenfell's voice came over the intercom once more. "Good work, team. One down, but the night's not over. Stay sharp." His words carried a quiet determination that resonated with every man aboard. The Gudgeon had delivered its first strike, but the hunt was far from over. The chase began almost immediately after the Gudgeon fired its first salvo. The crippled transport burned brightly on the surface, a beacon that drew the Japanese destroyers like predators to wounded prey. Inside the submarine, the crew braced for the inevitable retaliation. Depth charges began exploding in the water, distant booms that grew louder with each detonation. "Helm, hard to starboard," Grenfell ordered, his tone sharp but calm. "Take us toward the undersea ridge." The submarine responded with a subtle lurch, turning toward a rugged section of the seafloor. Grenfell had memorized the contours of this area before the mission, knowing the terrain could provide crucial cover. If they could weave through the underwater ridges and gullies, the uneven seabed would scatter enemy sonar and buy them precious time. Langley sat at his sonar station, his eyes glued to the faint signals appearing on the screen. The high-pitched pings of the Japanese destroyers reverberated through his headset, each one a stark reminder of how close they were. His voice quivered slightly as he called out updates. 2 destroyers, closing fast. Bearing 090. Grenfell leaned over his shoulder, his sharp gaze scanning the screen. "Hold steady, Langley," he said quietly. "They can't hit what they can't find." The submarine's descent into the rugged undersea valley was treacherous. Quartermaster Tom Foster gripped the helm tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the narrow space between jagged outcrops. "Watch that ridge," Grenfell warned. "We've got no room for error." Foster nodded, his focus unshakable. The Gudgeon crept forward at minimum speed, the engines throttled down to reduce noise. Every creak of the hull and groan of the machinery felt amplified in the silence. In the torpedo room, Hank Vargas and his team prepared for the next strike. Sweat dripped down Vargas's face as he double-checked the settings on the torpedoes. "Keep it quiet," he muttered to his crew. "These things don't need a reason to misfire." Charlie Brent, still pale from the earlier attack, handed him a wrench. "Everything's set," Brent said, his voice barely audible. Vargas glanced at him and managed a faint grin. "Set doesn't mean ready. Let's make sure they're both." Above them, the destroyer's depth charges fell in erratic patterns. The explosion sent shockwaves rippling through the water, shaking the submarine with each detonation. In the engine room, Chief McAllister and his team worked to keep the systems running smoothly. A sudden jolt knocked the gauge loose, sending sparks flying. McAllister lunged forward, grabbing the gauge and barking at his team. "Get that secured. We can't afford a short circuit now." His voice carried a mix of urgency and authority, driving his men to action. The Gudgeon reached the base of the undersea ridge, its hull just meters above the jagged seafloor. Grenfell gave the order to stop engines, letting the submarine drift with the gentle underwater currents. "Silent drift," he said. "Let the water carry us." This tactic, unconventional and risky, allowed the submarine to move without producing the telltale engine noise that could give away their position. Langley's hands trembled as he adjusted the sonar dials, trying to track the destroyer's movements. "They're splitting up," he whispered. "One's circling back, the other's sweeping the ridge." Grenfell nodded, his mind racing. "They're trying to box us in," he murmured. "We'll make them think they've succeeded." He ordered the submarine to angle slightly upward, positioning it behind an outcrop that jutted into the water column. The maneuver required pinpoint precision. Foster's hands were steady as he guided the Gudgeon into place, the sharp edge of the ridge blocking them from direct sonar sweeps. "We're tucked in," Foster reported, his voice tight. The crew held their breaths as the pings grew louder, the destroyers closing in. Grenfell stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the depth gauge. Langley's voice broke the silence. "One's directly above us, the other's moving to flank." The first depth charge hit the water moments later, detonating with a deafening roar that sent shock waves through the submarine. In the torpedo room, Vargas steadied himself against the bulkhead, his team scrambling to secure loose equipment. Brent glanced at him, fear etched on his face. "We're sitting ducks," Brent said. Vargas shook his head. "Not yet. Ducks don't shoot back." Grenfell ordered a sharp ascent, the submarine rising just enough to peek over the ridge. "Prepare for counterattack," he said. Langley tracked the lead destroyer, calling out its position as Grenfell calculated the firing solution. In the torpedo room, Vargas and his team loaded the tubes with swift precision. Despite the chaos around them, their movements were methodical, a testament to their training. "Fire one," Grenfell commanded. The first torpedo shot out, slicing through the water toward the destroyer. "Fire two." The second followed moments later. The crew waited in tense silence, the second stretching into an eternity. The first torpedo struck the destroyer's bow, a fiery explosion ripping through its structure. The second hit moments later, this time near the stern. The ship began to list, smoke and flames pouring from its hull. Cheers erupted in the torpedo room, but Vargas silenced them with a sharp look. "We're not done yet," he said. The remaining destroyer turned sharply, its searchlights sweeping furiously across the water. Grenfell ordered the Gudgeon to dive again, retreating into the shadows of the seafloor. Depth charges rained down, each explosion shaking the submarine to its core. In the control room, Langley struggled to maintain his composure as the sonar pings closed in. O'Hara, sitting nearby, gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "They haven't got us yet, kid," O'Hara said. "And they won't, not with the skipper at the helm." Grenfell's voice cut through the tension. "Bring us around. Heading 180. Slow and steady." The submarine slipped away, using the currents to mask its escape. The destroyer's sonar pings grew fainter until they disappeared entirely. As the crew regrouped, the exhaustion was palpable, but so was the sense of accomplishment. Grenfell addressed them over the intercom. "Another one down. We've dealt a serious blow tonight, but this isn't over. Stay sharp and stay ready. We'll hit them again when the time comes." In the torpedo room, Vargas leaned against the bulkhead, his face lit by the dim red lights. Brent handed him a canteen, his hand steadier now. "That was close," Brent said. Vargas smirked. "Close doesn't count out here. What counts is we're still breathing." The Gudgeon had survived another skirmish, but the crew knew the battle was far from over. With each strike, they pushed the limits of their endurance, proving that even a single submarine could challenge the might of the Japanese Armada. The night sea was a theater of chaos and deception, and Grenfell's mind worked faster than the oscillating sonar pings that hunted the Gudgeon. The towering silhouette of the Japanese carrier loomed on the periscope screen, framed by escorting destroyers and faintly illuminated by flashes from the carrier's deck lights. Planes were being prepped for launch, despite the mayhem of earlier attacks. The target was tantalizingly close, yet heavily shielded by layers of steel and vigilance. Grenfell took a long, slow breath and stepped back from the periscope. His eyes scanned the cramped control room, landing on each member of his crew. "We'll use their noise against them," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "That carrier's wake is louder than anything we can generate. We'll ride it in." It was a bold move. Instead of trying to evade detection in silence, Grenfell aimed to hide the Gudgeon within the turbulence created by the carrier's massive propellers. The submarine edged closer to the convoy, threading between escort ships like a shadow. The risk was immense. One wrong move, and the submarine would surface into the teeth of a destroyer. Langley's fingers hovered over the sonar controls, fine-tuning the equipment to filter out the cacophony above. "Carrier wake incoming," he reported, his voice taut. The sonar pings began to distort as the submarine slipped into the carrier's wake, the water vibrating with energy from the massive propellers. Grenfell nodded, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Good. Let them think we're just more churn." Below deck, Vargas and Brent worked in tandem, their movements synchronized from countless drills. Brent tightened the clamps on a torpedo while Vargas calibrated the depth settings. "This is it," Vargas muttered, his voice low but firm. "If these don't hit, we're done." Brent hesitated, then glanced at Vargas. "Do you ever get used to this?" Vargas didn't look up, his hands steady on the controls. "You don't get used to it, kid. You just learn to do it anyway." As the Gudgeon drew closer, the tension among the crew was palpable. O'Hara paced near the radio equipment, his usual humor replaced by a grim silence. Foster leaned over the navigation charts, double-checking their position. "We're threading a needle," he said quietly. O'Hara stopped pacing and clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll thread it. You always do." Grenfell watched the carrier's movements carefully, timing each decision with precision. "Torpedo room. Stand by," he ordered. His voice carried through the intercom, a steadying force amid the tension. Vargas responded immediately, his tone clipped and professional. "Standing by." The carrier's bulk filled the periscope's view. Grenfell adjusted the focus, his gaze narrowing. "Flood tubes 1 and 2. Set depth for below the keel." The command was relayed, and the crew moved as one, their focus absolute. The first torpedo fired with a muffled rush, followed by the second. In the control room, Langley's sonar picked up the distinct sounds of the torpedoes slicing through the water. Grenfell lowered the periscope and gave the next order. "Hard to starboard. Take us deeper." Seconds felt like hours as the torpedoes raced toward their target. Then, the sea erupted. The first explosion rocked the carrier, sending a plume of water and debris into the air. The second struck moments later, detonating with a force that reverberated through the Gudgeon's hull. Langley's voice broke the silence. "Direct hit? She's listing." The celebration was brief. Above, the escorts reacted instantly, their searchlights stabbing through the darkness as destroyers surged toward the submarine's last known position. Grenfell's voice was calm but firm. "Engines to half. Dive to 300 feet." Depth charges began to rain down, each explosion rattling the submarine. In the engine room, McAllister shouted over the noise. "We've got a coolant leak in the starboard system." redirecting flow. His team moved with practiced efficiency, sealing the leak and stabilizing the engines. Langley's hands flew over the sonar controls as he tracked the destroyers. "They're triangulating," he warned. Grenfell nodded, issuing a series of rapid orders. "Bring us left, 10 degrees. Level off at 350 feet. Use the cross-current to drift." The Gudgeon maneuvered deftly, its crew working in perfect harmony. Foster's hands were steady on the controls, his focus unbroken even as shock waves from nearby depth charges rocked the submarine. "They're trying to box us in," he said through gritted teeth. Grenfell's eyes remained on the depth gauge. "Then we'll slip through the cracks." In the torpedo room, Vargas and Brent braced themselves against the bulkhead as another explosion shook the submarine. Brent exhaled sharply, his nerves frayed. "How do we keep doing this?" Vargas looked at him, a rare flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Because we have to. Because if we don't, nobody else will." O'Hara sat near the radio equipment, his hands clutching a photograph of his family. He glanced at Foster, who was hunched over the navigation charts. "What do you think they'll say back home?" O'Hara asked, his voice low. Foster didn't look up. "If we make it back, they'll call us heroes. If we don't, they'll call us fools." O'Hara managed a faint smile. "Well, here's to being heroic fools." The attacks intensified, the destroyers dropping depth charges in tighter patterns. Grenfell made the call to take the Gudgeon even deeper, pushing the submarine to its limits. The hull groaned under the pressure, a haunting reminder of how precarious their situation was. McAllister's voice came through the intercom, strained but steady. "Systems holding, but we're redlining on the starboard pump. If this keeps up," Grenfell cut him off. "Do what you can, Chief. We're almost through." The destroyer's sonar pings grew fainter as the Gudgeon slipped into a deeper current. Grenfell ordered the engines to idle, letting the submarine drift silently. The crew held their breaths, the tension almost unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, Langley spoke. "They're pulling back. Escorts are moving toward the carrier." A collective sigh of relief swept through the control room. Grenfell straightened, his expression as resolute as ever. "We're not out of this yet. Stay sharp." In the torpedo room, Vargas slumped against the bulkhead, exhaustion etched on his face. Brent handed him a canteen, his own hands trembling. "We hit her, didn't we?" Brent asked. Vargas nodded. "Yeah, we hit her. And we're still alive. That's 2 wins." The Gudgeon had delivered a crippling blow to the Japanese fleet, but the crew knew their mission was far from over. As they drifted deeper into the ocean's shadows, their resolve only strengthened. Together, they would face whatever came next, proving that even the smallest force could make the biggest impact. The Gudgeon lay motionless at 400 feet, shrouded in the pitch-black abyss of the Pacific. Silence enveloped the submarine, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation systems. For hours, the crew had endured a relentless barrage of depth charges, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Grenfell sat in the captain's chair, his expression a mask of calm determination. The submarine had survived the initial assault, but the enemy wasn't giving up. Langley adjusted the sonar, his brow furrowed in concentration. Multiple pings, 3 destroyers, closing fast. They're sweeping in a staggered pattern. His voice was steady, but the tension in the room was palpable. Grenfell leaned forward, his mind racing. "They're boxing us in. We need to break their pattern." In the torpedo room, Vargas and Brent worked tirelessly to secure the remaining weapons. Vargas wiped sweat from his brow, his hands steady despite the pounding of the charges above. "If they pin us here, we're done," he muttered. Brent looked up, his face pale. "What can we do?" Vargas glanced at him, his eyes narrowing. "Trust the captain. He always finds a way." Above, the destroyers deployed their next salvo. The first detonation shook the submarine violently, sending a cascade of dust and debris raining from the bulkheads. McAllister's voice crackled over the intercom. Starboard ballast tank is leaking. Attempting to stabilize. In the engine room, McAllister and his team worked frantically to contain the damage. Steam hissed from a ruptured pipe, and the acrid smell of oil filled the air. "Hand me the wrench," he barked, his hands moving with practiced precision. In the control room, Foster gripped the navigation controls, his knuckles white. "We've got no room to maneuver," he said, his voice tight. Grenfell's gaze remained fixed on the depth gauge. "Not yet. We'll make them think we're drifting." It was a risky gambit. Grenfell ordered the engines cut, allowing the Gudgeon to drift silently with the underwater current. The hope was that the destroyers, relying on sonar, would mistake the lack of movement for a damaged or sunken target. Langley adjusted the sonar settings, his heart pounding. "They're slowing down," he reported. 2 destroyers holding position, one circling back. The brief reprieve allowed the crew to catch their breath, but the tension was far from over. O'Hara sat at the radio station, his hands trembling as he adjusted the dials. "I'd give anything for some music right now," he muttered. Foster managed a weak smile. "Keep dreaming, Jimmy. We've got our own orchestra up there." Grenfell stood, his mind already calculating their next move. "We're not out of this yet. They're waiting for us to make a mistake." Langley, monitor their positions. Vargas, prepare decoys. The plan was simple. Deploy noise-making devices to create false sonar signatures, drawing the destroyers away from the submarine's true position. Vargas and Brent worked quickly, setting the decoys to mimic the Gudgeon's acoustic profile. "Ready to deploy," Vargas reported. Grenfell gave the order, and the devices were launched into the water. Langley watched the sonar screen intently. "It's working. 2 destroyers are breaking off, chasing the decoys." The crew's relief was short-lived. The remaining destroyer, undeterred, continued its search. Grenfell's eyes narrowed as he studied the sonar readout. "They're not buying it. Time for Plan B." Plan B was as audacious as it was dangerous. Grenfell ordered the submarine to ascend slightly, positioning it above a narrow underwater ridge. The goal was to force the destroyer to pass overhead, using the ridge to mask the Gudgeon's position. Foster guided the submarine with painstaking precision, the hull groaning under the strain. "Hold steady," Grenfell said, his voice low. The destroyer's sonar pings grew louder, the sound reverberating through the submarine. Langley's fingers danced over the controls. "They're right on top of us," he whispered. The tension in the control room was suffocating. Above, the destroyer unleashed another volley of depth charges. The explosion shook the submarine violently, dislodging equipment and sending men sprawling. In the engine room, McAllister and his team fought to maintain control. "We're losing pressure in the starboard engine," McAllister shouted. "Bypass the system," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. In the torpedo room, Vargas braced himself against a bulkhead as another charge detonated nearby. Brent clung to a support beam, his face pale. "How much more of this can we take?" he asked. Vargas glanced at him, his expression grim. "Enough. We have to." The Gudgeon held its position, the ridge providing just enough cover to avoid detection. The destroyer's sonar pings began to fade, and Langley exhaled a shaky breath. "They're moving on," he reported. The crew allowed themselves a moment of relief, but Grenfell remained vigilant. "We're not out of this yet. Maintain silent running." As the submarine drifted deeper into the shadows, the crew worked tirelessly to repair the damage. McAllister and his team sealed the leaks and stabilized the engines, their hands blackened with oil and grime. In the control room, Foster recalibrated the navigation systems, his focus unbroken. Grenfell addressed the crew over the intercom, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We've survived the worst. Keep your heads in the game. We've got a long way to go." In the torpedo room, Vargas and Brent sat in exhausted silence. Brent broke the quiet, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they'll write about us in the history books?" Vargas managed a faint smile. "If we make it back, maybe. If not, I guess we'll just be another mystery of the deep. The Gudgeon pressed on, its crew battered but unbroken. They had weathered the storm, but the journey home was far from over. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, driven by the unshakable determination to survive. The Pacific stretched vast and unforgiving as the USS Gudgeon began its perilous journey home. The submarine moved cautiously, avoiding areas where enemy patrols were most concentrated. Every moment felt like a gamble, with the odds of survival teetering dangerously against them. Grenfell's calculated demeanor belied the immense pressure he faced, knowing that one mistake could doom them all. Langley sat hunched over the sonar console, his ears attuned to the faintest sounds. "We've got engine noise to the northwest. Large surface vessels," he reported. Grenfell nodded, mentally mapping the enemy's likely course. "Maintain current depth. We'll let them pass." The Gudgeon slowed to a crawl, its engines barely audible as it hugged the edge of an underwater canyon. Meanwhile, in the engine room, McAllister and his team continued their tireless efforts to keep the submarine operational. The earlier depth charge attacks had left scars, leaking seals, misaligned valves, and a damaged compressor. McAllister wiped oil from his hands as he inspected the latest repair. "This patchwork won't hold forever," he muttered. His assistant, a young machinist named Carter, replied, "It doesn't have to, just long enough to get us home." The crew's spirits wavered between hope and despair as days turned into nights, the submarine inching closer to safety. Supplies were running low. O'Hara, the radio operator, scanned the frequencies in vain for updates from command. Static greeted him at every turn, a stark reminder of their isolation. "Still nothing," he reported, shaking his head. In the galley, Foster sat with a group of sailors, dividing the remaining rations. "Half rations from here on out," he announced. Groans filled the room, but no one argued. "Better half a biscuit today than nothing tomorrow," Foster added with a wry smile, trying to lighten the mood. Grenfell addressed the crew over the intercom. "We're entering the final stretch. I know you're tired, and I know you're hungry, but we've made it this far together. Let's finish what we started." His words, though measured, carried a weight that resonated with the crew. The tension reached its peak when Langley picked up a faint ping on the sonar. "Submarine, starboard quarter," he whispered. Grenfell's mind raced. It could be one of theirs, but it could just as easily be an enemy. "Hold course," he ordered. "Let's see if they're hunting or hiding." The minutes dragged as the two submarines maneuvered in the silent depths. The enemy sub, if that's what it was, made no aggressive moves, and Grenfell breathed a sigh of relief when its sonar signature faded into the distance. "They're running silent, too," Langley observed. "They must be as nervous as we are." The Gudgeon surfaced under the cover of darkness to recharge its batteries. The night sky was a canopy of stars, offering a momentary reprieve from the oppressive confines of the submarine. Vargas stood on the conning tower, scanning the horizon with binoculars. "Clear," he reported. Grenfell joined him, the two men sharing a rare moment of quiet. "Think we'll make it?" Vargas asked. Grenfell's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "We didn't come this far to fail now." Below deck, the crew took advantage of the brief surfacing. Carter worked quickly to clean the air filters, while O'Hara adjusted the radio antenna in a last-ditch effort to establish contact. "Come on, give me something," he muttered. Finally, a faint signal crackled through the static. "This is Pearl Harbor. All units report status." O'Hara's heart leapt. "This is USS Gudgeon, en route to base. Minimal damage. Low on supplies." "Over." The reply was immediate. "Gudgeon, good to hear from you. Expect escort rendezvous at coordinates sent via encrypted signal." "Godspeed." O'Hara relayed the message to Grenfell, who allowed himself a rare smile. Finally, a break. But their relief was short-lived. As dawn broke, Langley detected multiple contacts approaching fast. "Destroyers coming in hot," he warned. Grenfell ordered an immediate dive, the Gudgeon slipping below the surface as the enemy closed in. The chase was relentless. The destroyers crisscrossed the area, their sonar beams probing the depths. The Gudgeon navigated the underwater terrain with surgical precision, weaving through rocky outcroppings and narrow channels. The crew held their breath as depth charges detonated around them, the shock waves rattling the submarine. In the control room, Foster gripped the helm tightly, his hands steady despite the chaos. "They're closing the gap," Langley reported, his voice strained. Grenfell's mind worked furiously. "Take us deeper. We'll ride the thermocline." The submarine descended into the cold, dense layer, its engines reduced to a whisper. The destroyers continued their barrage, but the Gudgeon's position remained elusive. Hours passed, the tension unrelenting. Finally, the pings began to fade. The destroyers were moving on, their prey seemingly vanished. The crew allowed themselves a moment of cautious relief, but Grenfell remained vigilant. "Keep us at depth for now. We'll surface only when it's safe." As night fell, the Gudgeon surfaced again, its battered hull breaking the waves. The crew emerged, weary but resolute. O'Hara quickly relayed their position to Pearl Harbor, and the coordinates for the escort arrived moments later. The final leg of the journey was fraught with challenges, but the Gudgeon pressed on. Each mile brought them closer to safety, the promise of home driving them forward. As they approached the rendezvous point, a distant silhouette appeared on the horizon. The escort, a pair of destroyers, signaled their arrival. Cheers erupted on the Gudgeon, the crew's exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Grenfell watched the escort through his binoculars, his expression softening. "We made it," he said quietly. As the submarine entered the harbor, the sight of American flags waving in the breeze brought tears to many eyes. The crew stood on deck, their uniforms tattered but their spirits unbroken. They were greeted as heroes, their harrowing journey a testament to their courage and resilience. The Gudgeon had defied the odds, outmaneuvering one of the most formidable naval forces in history. Its crew, though battered and worn, had emerged victorious. Together, they had accomplished the impossible. The impact of the USS Gudgeon's audacious mission rippled far beyond the cramped corridors of the submarine. While the crew grappled with their memories and exhaustion, the Navy's high command in Pearl Harbor and Washington, D.C., began to piece together the true significance of what had transpired. The loss of the Japanese aircraft carrier, coupled with the disruption of key supply lines, marked a turning point in the Pacific theater. Admiral Chester Nimitz reviewed the initial reports with a mixture of satisfaction and awe. The Gudgeon's actions had forced the Japanese to alter their convoy routes and tighten their fleet's formations, changes that placed enormous strain on their resources. "One submarine, and they're scrambling," Nimitz remarked to his staff. "This is the future of naval warfare." Meanwhile, the story of the Gudgeon began to spread among the ranks of the Navy. Sailors whispered about the submarine that had taken on an armada, a tale that inspired both admiration and a renewed sense of purpose. "If they can do that in the middle of enemy waters," one officer said during a briefing, "what excuse do we have not to push harder?" News of the mission reached the press, though many of the details remained classified. Headlines lauded the heroism of the submarine crew, describing them as silent warriors who struck a decisive blow against the Japanese Navy. For families on the home front, the story became a symbol of hope amid the uncertainty of war. At the same time, military analysts pored over the Gudgeon's after-action reports. The tactics employed by Captain Grenfell, his use of the thermocline, his daring approach to the Japanese carrier, and his ability to evade relentless counterattacks, were studied and incorporated into training programs. Submarine commanders across the fleet began adopting similar techniques, recognizing the value of stealth and precision in an era dominated by larger surface engagements. Grenfell's leadership was particularly highlighted. His calm under pressure, strategic insight, and ability to inspire his crew became case studies at the Naval War College. Officers who served with him testified to his unwavering focus and his ability to make bold decisions without recklessness. "He made us believe we could do the impossible," Vargas later told a reporter. And then we went out and did it. The technological implications of the mission were equally profound. Engineers examined the Gudgeon's equipment and identified areas for improvement. The failure rate of the torpedoes, a recurring issue during the mission, prompted a complete overhaul of the Navy's torpedo design and manufacturing processes. Within months, newer, more reliable torpedoes began rolling off production lines, ensuring future missions would not face the same challenges. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, faced a sobering reality. The destruction of their carrier and the loss of critical supplies forced them to rethink their strategy in the Pacific. Intelligence intercepts revealed frustration among their commanders, who struggled to maintain their logistical lifelines under constant threat from American submarines. The Gudgeon's mission also underscored the importance of Allied cooperation. British intelligence played a vital role in decrypting Japanese naval codes, providing the information that guided the submarine's initial deployment. Australian forces, too, contributed by monitoring Japanese troop movements and sharing reconnaissance data. These efforts highlighted the interconnectedness of the Allied war effort and reinforced the importance of collaboration. As the war progressed, the lessons learned from the Gudgeon's mission continued to shape strategy and tactics. Submarine operations became a cornerstone of the Allied offensive, crippling Japan's ability to sustain its sprawling empire. The daring actions of one submarine had demonstrated the outsized impact a single vessel could have, paving the way for future victories. But for the crew of the Gudgeon, the mission was more than just a strategic success. It was a testament to their resilience, ingenuity, and unbreakable bond. As they stood on the deck during their triumphant return, their battered but unyielding submarine a stark contrast to the cheering crowds, they knew they had achieved something extraordinary. In the days that followed, Grenfell and his crew were summoned to a ceremony at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz himself presented them with commendations, his words echoing the sentiment of a grateful nation. "You've shown us what courage looks like," he said, "and you've reminded us that even in the darkest hours, a handful of determined men can turn the tide." The USS Gudgeon would not rest for long. Repairs were quickly underway, and soon it would return to the fight, its crew ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their mission had not just disrupted the enemy. It had ignited a spark of defiance and determination that would carry the Allies through the long struggle to come. For the men who lived it, the Gudgeon's story was one of survival, sacrifice, and triumph against overwhelming odds. But for the Navy and the nation, it became something more, a symbol of the unyielding spirit that would ultimately prevail in the Pacific War. In the aftermath of their extraordinary mission, the crew of the USS Gudgeon found themselves grappling with a sense of purpose unlike anything they had experienced before. Their actions had not only shaken the Japanese Navy, but also placed them at the forefront of a new chapter in naval warfare. As the war continued, each member of the crew faced a daunting question: what comes next? Captain James Grenfell's name was now synonymous with audacity and precision. After the mission, he was assigned to train the next generation of submarine captains at Pearl Harbor. His lectures were filled with vivid anecdotes from his time on the Gudgeon, emphasizing the importance of creativity and calm under pressure. "War is unpredictable," he told his students. "Your job is to make sure you're the one who's always 2 steps ahead." Grenfell's strategic mind earned him further respect as he contributed to developing innovative doctrines for undersea combat, drawing on his first-hand experiences. But Grenfell's professional achievements came with a personal cost. The weight of command, the lives lost under his orders, and the harrowing memories of near-death encounters left their scars. Though he rarely spoke of it, his crew knew that the captain who seemed invincible in battle was not immune to the emotional toll of war. For Vargas, the Gudgeon's torpedo officer, life after the mission was both a blessing and a curse. The victory cemented his reputation as a brilliant tactician, but the repeated malfunctions of the torpedoes during the mission haunted him. He worked tirelessly to refine the Navy's weapon systems, often clashing with bureaucratic inertia in the process. "We can't afford another mission like ours with unreliable gear," he argued at one meeting. his voice heavy with frustration. His persistence paid off. Within a year, the Navy had rolled out a redesigned torpedo with vastly improved performance. Chief Engineer McAllister returned to the Navy Yard in San Francisco, where his expertise in damage control became the backbone of new submarine designs. He was celebrated for his ingenuity during the Gudgeon's darkest moments, but his greatest pride came from mentoring young engineers. "The sea doesn't forgive mistakes," he would say, "but if you're smart and resourceful, it might just give you a second chance." The junior crew members, including O'Hara and Langley, carried the legacy of the mission into their future endeavors. O'Hara's quiet determination and unyielding focus had been pivotal during the Gudgeon's most perilous hours. He went on to command his own submarine, bringing the lessons he had learned under Grenfell to a new generation of sailors. Langley, whose keen instincts on sonar had saved the Gudgeon more than once, transitioned into naval intelligence, where he helped refine the fleet's use of sonar and other detection technologies. Not all stories ended on a triumphant note. The families of those who did not return from the mission bore the weight of their loss with quiet dignity. Memorial services were held across the country, where the names of the fallen were read aloud, their sacrifices etched into the collective memory of a grateful nation. Grenfell attended as many of these ceremonies as he could, his presence a somber reminder of the cost of victory. The USS Gudgeon itself became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. After extensive repairs, the submarine returned to active duty, her crew determined to honor the legacy of their comrades. She continued to serve with distinction, her every patrol a testament to the skill and courage of those who had sailed her into the heart of danger. Years later, as the war came to an end, the Gudgeon story became a cornerstone of naval history. Documentaries, books, and museum exhibits celebrated the submarine that had defied an armada. The vessel was eventually decommissioned, but her legacy endured in the annals of military history and the hearts of those who had known her. The crew members who survived the war remained close, bound by their shared experiences. At reunions, they would reminisce about their time aboard the Gudgeon, their laughter tinged with the bittersweet memory of those who had not made it home. Grenfell, ever the mentor, would remind them of the mission's greater purpose. "We didn't just fight a battle," he would say. "We proved what a handful of determined people can achieve against impossible odds." The mission's impact resonated through the decades. The tactics and strategies honed aboard the Gudgeon influenced the Navy's approach to submarine warfare long after the war's end. The lessons of courage, innovation, and teamwork became guiding principles for generations of sailors who followed in the crew's footsteps. In 1960, a monument was unveiled at Pearl Harbor to honor the submarine crews who had served in the Pacific Theater. The USS Gudgeon was given a place of prominence, her story recounted for all who visited. Grenfell, now retired, attended the ceremony alongside Vargas, McAllister, O'Hara, and Langley. Standing before the monument, they reflected on the journey that had brought them there, on the lives they had saved, the friends they had lost, and the legacy they had forged together. As the crowd dispersed, Grenfell lingered, his gaze fixed on the inscription at the base of the monument. "To those who dared the depths for freedom, your courage lights the way." It was a fitting tribute to the men of the Gudgeon and to all who had risked everything for a cause greater than themselves. The USS Gudgeon was more than a submarine. It was a symbol of defiance, determination, and the unyielding human spirit. And as its story continued to inspire, it ensured that the sacrifices made in the dark waters of the Pacific would never be forgotten. Let me know if this meets your expectations for the 9th chapter. The story of the USS Gudgeon stands as a testament to the unwavering courage, determination, and ingenuity of those who fought against impossible odds. Its mission, though carried out in the shadows of the Pacific depths, illuminated critical lessons for naval warfare and inspired generations to come. The daring exploits of the Gudgeon revealed a fundamental truth about war. Victory often depends not on the size of the forces involved, but on the willpower and resourcefulness of those engaged. For Captain James Grenfell, the mission underscored the power of adaptive thinking and the necessity of making decisive, bold choices under pressure. His leadership not only guided the Gudgeon through its perilous journey, but also left an indelible mark on naval strategy. In the years following the war, the United States Navy undertook a comprehensive review of submarine tactics, with the Gudgeon's mission serving as a cornerstone of this evolution. Innovations such as enhanced sonar systems, improved torpedoes, and new stealth techniques were all influenced by the harrowing experiences of Grenfell and his crew. These advancements reshaped the role of submarines in naval warfare, cementing their status as a crucial element of modern fleets. The legacy of the Gudgeon extended far beyond the confines of military strategy. It became a symbol of resilience and defiance for a nation rallying against adversity. Newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated the submarine's achievements, sharing stories of bravery and sacrifice that resonated with the American public. In towns across the country, people organized gatherings to honor the crew, turning the Gudgeon into a household name. But while the submarine's legacy was widely celebrated, its crew carried the weight of their experiences in deeply personal ways. For some, like Grenfell, the mission became a defining moment in their lives, shaping their careers and perspectives. For others, it was a reminder of the friends and comrades who had not returned, a bittersweet memory of triumph forged in the face of loss. As time passed, the Gudgeon's story was preserved in books, films, and museums, ensuring that future generations would remember the courage of those who had served aboard it. In classrooms, children learned about the daring maneuvers and decisive strikes that had turned the tide of the Pacific War. In naval academies, cadets studied the mission as a masterclass in strategy and perseverance. The final chapter of the Gudgeon's story was written not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet reflections of those who lived to tell it. At reunions and ceremonies, former crew members gathered to share their memories, their laughter mingling with tears as they recounted the mission that had changed their lives. They spoke of Grenfell's unshakable resolve, Vargas's relentless determination, and a collective spirit that had carried them through the darkest moments. One such ceremony, held decades after the war's end, brought together the surviving crew members and their families at Pearl Harbor. Beneath the warm Hawaiian sun, they stood before a newly unveiled memorial dedicated to the USS Gudgeon and its crew. The monument, a sleek granite obelisk etched with the names of those who had served, bore an inscription that captured the essence of their journey. In the depths of danger, they found their courage. In the face of adversity, they forged their legacy. To the crew of the USS Gudgeon, whose bravery defied the tides of history, we owe our eternal gratitude. As the crowd fell silent, Grenfell stepped forward to lay a wreath at the base of the monument. His hands, weathered by time, trembled slightly as he placed the flowers, but his voice was steady as he addressed those gathered. "What we accomplished on the Gudgeon was not just a victory in war," he said. "It was a testament to what can be achieved when people come together with a shared purpose and an unyielding determination to succeed." In the years that followed, the USS Gudgeon remained a symbol of the enduring human spirit. Its story inspired countless acts of bravery and innovation, a reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, individuals have the power to make a difference. For those who served aboard the Gudgeon, the submarine was more than a vessel. It was a crucible of courage, a proving ground for their character, and a place where they forged bonds that would last a lifetime. Their story is not just one of war, but of humanity, of individuals rising above fear and doubt to achieve the extraordinary. As the final rays of sunlight illuminated the monument at Pearl Harbor, a gentle breeze carried the echoes of the Gudgeon's legacy across the water. It was a legacy not only of defiance and determination, but also of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest depths, the light of human courage can shine brightly enough to guide the way forward. And so, the USS Gudgeon sailed into history, its story a beacon for all who seek to defy the impossible and triumph against all odds. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps this community growing and motivates me to bring you more incredible stories.